Kyle's hand was trembling that he was about to kill a human being for the first time. Through his scope, the woman appeared, walking toward the Marines with a bomb in her hand that he had only 3 seconds to pull the trigger, but this decision would change his life forever. The March sun beat down mercilessly on the streets of Nasiriyah as 25-year-old Petty Officer Kyle positioned himself behind his SR-25 sniper rifle. It was March 2003, just days into the Iraq invasion, and Kyle was experiencing his first combat deployment as a Navy SEAL. The rifle felt foreign in his hands despite months of training. Everything about this moment felt surreal. Through his scope, Kyle watched American Marines advancing through the narrow street below. 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines were conducting a house-to-house sweep, searching for weapons caches and hostile fighters. The operation should have been routine until Kyle spotted movement in a doorway 200 yards down the street. A woman emerged from the shadows, and Kyle's blood ran cold. She was young, maybe early 20s, wearing traditional Iraqi clothing. But what made Kyle's heart race wasn't her appearance, it was what she carried. In her left arm, she cradled a small child, no more than 2 years old. In her right hand, she held what Kyle immediately recognized as an RGD-5 hand grenade. "Control, this is Overwatch," Kyle whispered into his radio, his voice barely audible. "I have eyes on a female subject, approximately 200 yards southeast of Marine position. She's carrying what appears to be an explosive device." The response crackled back immediately. "Overwatch, confirm visual on explosive device." Kyle adjusted his scope's magnification, his hands no longer steady. Through the optics, he could see the distinctive ridged surface of the Soviet-era grenade, its safety pin clearly visible. The woman was walking deliberately toward the Marines, who remained unaware of the approaching threat. But this wasn't just any target. This was a woman holding a child. Kyle had trained for months at sniper school, fired thousands of rounds at paper targets and steel silhouettes. He'd studied ballistics, learned windage calculations, and mastered the fundamentals of precision shooting, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. Chief Petty Officer Mike Dauber, Kyle's spotter, lay beside him with high-powered binoculars. "Kid, you seeing what I'm seeing?" Dauber's voice carried the weight of someone who'd made similar decisions before. "Yeah, Chief, woman with a child and what looks like a grenade." Kyle's voice cracked slightly. "She's moving toward our Marines." Dauber studied the situation through his optics. The woman was now 150 yards from the Marine patrol, walking with purpose rather than the random movement of a civilian trying to avoid the fighting. Her body language suggested intent, not fear. "Range to target?" Dauber asked, shifting into the methodical routine that might help Kyle focus on technical aspects rather than emotional implications. 200 meters. "Wind negligible, clear shot." Kyle's training was taking over, but his mind was racing with thoughts that hadn't appeared in any manual. What if she's being coerced? What if the grenade isn't active? What if she's just scared and doesn't understand what she's doing? Through his scope, Kyle could see the Marines clearly. Sergeant Johnson was leading his squad through a systematic building search, completely unaware of the approaching threat. Corporal Martinez was providing security, but his attention was focused on potential threats from windows and rooftops, not pedestrian traffic behind them. The woman was now 120 yards from the Marines. At her current pace, she would reach grenade throwing range in less than 30 seconds. "Overwatch, this is Control," the radio crackled. "What's your assessment of the threat?" Kyle's mouth went dry. How do you assess the threat level of a mother with a child? How do you calculate the probability that someone holding a baby intends to commit suicide bombing? These weren't equations they'd taught him at sniper school. Female subject continuing to advance on Marine position. She's carrying what appears to be an RGD-5 fragmentation grenade, distance now approximately 120 meters from friendly forces. Control copies. Rules of engagement are clear. If you assess imminent threat to American personnel, you are authorized to engage. Authorized to engage, the phrase echoed in Kyle's head like a death sentence. He was authorized to kill a woman holding a child. The legal framework was clear, but the moral complexity was overwhelming. But here's what Kyle was beginning to understand. This was exactly the kind of moment that defined not just individual soldiers, but the entire nature of modern warfare. Wars weren't won or lost based on grand strategies or overwhelming firepower. They were decided by split-second decisions made by young men and women who had to live with the consequences forever. Dauber noticed Kyle's hesitation. "Son, I know what you're thinking, but look at that woman's movement pattern. Look at how she's approaching our Marines. This isn't random civilian behavior." Kyle forced himself to study the woman's actions objectively. She was walking in a straight line toward the Marine position, maintaining consistent pace despite the obvious danger of being in an active combat zone. Normal civilians would seek cover, move erratically, or try to avoid military personnel entirely. this woman was deliberately closing distance with American forces while carrying an explosive device. Distance 100 meters, Kyle reported, his voice steadier now as training began to override. Emotion, target maintaining direct approach to friendly position. The child in the woman's arms was crying, the sound carrying across the urban landscape. Kyle could hear it clearly, even from 200 yards away. That sound would haunt him for years, regardless of what decision he made in the next few seconds. She's 80 meters from our Marines, Dauber observed. Effective grenade range is 30 to 40 meters. If she intends to use that device, she'll act within the next 20 seconds. Kyle's breathing became controlled, falling into the rhythm he'd practiced thousands of times at sniper school. His heart rate slowed, his body entering the state that enabled precision shooting under stress. But his mind was anything but calm. What if he was wrong? What if the woman was confused, scared, even trying to surrender? What if she didn't realize that carrying a grenade would be seen as threatening? Kyle had been in Iraq less than a week. That he didn't yet understand the culture, the customs, or the desperate motives that might drive civilians in a war zone. But what if he was right? What if she intended to kill herself and as many Marines as possible, using her child as cover? Briefings had warned about this exact tactic, women with grenades, children used as shields. That he forced his mind back to fundamentals. Positive ID, threat assessment, no hesitation when lives were at stake. That he could almost hear the instructors from sniper school reminding him, take the shot only when you're certain. Their voices clashed with another sound, the child's sharp, panicked wail echoing in his headset. Kyle studied every detail, the grenade pressed against her chest, the child clinging tighter, the rise and fall of her shoulders, wind drift checked, scope steady, trigger finger resting lightly. His body was ready, his conscience wasn't. Memories intruded, his sister's laugh, his father's voice teaching him to steady a breath. Normal fragments from a world far removed from this rooftop, they contrasted brutally with the reality that he was deciding who lived and who died. Radio chatter hummed in his ear, but no one else saw what he saw. They trusted him to choose correctly. He imagined the consequences in widening ripples. If he hesitated, Marines might be torn apart by the blast. That if he fired, there would be questions, investigations. A life ended with the pull of his trigger. He reminded himself of duty. He had sworn to act when hesitation would cost others their lives, but duty didn't erase empathy. He felt it twisting inside him, an ache for the woman, for the child, for what war had turned them into. His finger hovered, for a heartbeat. He wished for a miracle, that someone else could intervene, that the grenade might vanish. But miracles weren't part of a sniper's trade. The woman shifted, the child whimpered, and the Marines below moved closer into danger. Kyle exhaled, his training took over, clean and deliberate, crosshairs settled. Trigger broke, the shot cracked, sharp and final. Even before the body fell, Kyle knew the sound would echo long after the report faded. The blast had been prevented, but the weight of the choice was only beginning. 70 meters, Kyle announced. She's not deviating from course. Through his scope, Kyle could see the woman's face clearly now. She looked determined rather than frightened. Her eyes were focused on the Marine patrol, not scanning for safety or escape routes. Everything about her behavior suggested purposeful movement toward a specific objective. The moral weight of the decision was crushing. Kyle understood that he was about to cross a line that could never be uncrossed. His first kill would be a woman holding a child, an image that would define his understanding of warfare and his role as a sniper for the rest of his career. Control, this is Overwatch. Female subject now 70 meters from Marine position, continuing direct approach. She appears committed to engaging American forces. Overwatch, you have authorization to engage if you assess imminent threat to American personnel. Kyle's finger moved to the trigger guard. The SR-25 was already zeroed for 200 meters, requiring no scope adjustment. Wind was minimal, atmospheric conditions perfect for precision shooting. From a technical standpoint, this was an easy shot. From every other standpoint, it was the most difficult decision of his life. 60 meters, Dauber called out, "Kid, you need to make this decision now." In 30 seconds, she'll be in grenade range of our Marines. Kyle thought about the Marines below. Sergeant Johnson had a wife and 2 kids back in North Carolina. Corporal Martinez was planning to get married when he returned from deployment. Lance Corporal Williams had just turned 19 and still sent letters to his mother every week. These weren't abstract strategic assets, they were young men with families, dreams, and lives that extended far beyond this Iraqi street. But the woman approaching them also had a life. She had given birth to the child she was carrying. She had hopes and fears and relationships that Kyle would never understand. The child in her arms was innocent regardless of what his mother intended. 50 meters. Kyle's breathing reached the perfect rhythm, his heart rate dropped to the minimal level that eliminated microscopic movements that could affect accuracy, his finger found the trigger with the gentle pressure he'd practiced thousands of times. This was the moment of decision that would define everything that followed. Through his scope, Kyle could see the woman's hand adjusting her grip on the grenade. The movement was subtle but unmistakable. She was preparing to pull the pin, taking the shot. Kyle whispered. The SR-25 fired with a sharp crack that echoed off the concrete buildings surrounding the street. The 7.62mm round covered the 200 meters to target in less than a quarter second, arriving with the precision that months of training had promised. Kyle watched through his scope as the woman collapsed immediately. The grenade fell from her hand, rolling several feet away from her body. The child tumbled free, crying but apparently uninjured. Target down, Kyle reported, his voice emotionless. Despite the turmoil in his mind, threat neutralized. The Marines below spun toward the sound of gunfire, finally becoming aware of the danger that had been approaching them. Sergeant Johnson immediately spotted the fallen woman and the grenade lying near her body. Jesus Christ, Johnson's voice carried clearly across the street. She had a fucking grenade. Where did that shot come from? Dauber keyed his radio. Marine Patrol, this is Navy Overwatch. Threat has been neutralized. Recommend you secure the area and check on the child. Kyle remained motionless behind his rifle, watching as the Marines cautiously approached the woman's body. Corporal Martinez carefully picked up the crying child while Sergeant Johnson examined the grenade. After a few moments, Johnson's voice crackled over the radio frequency. Overwatch, this is Marine ground. Grenade pin was already pulled. Safety lever was being held in place manually. This device was armed and ready to detonate. The confirmation hit Kyle like a physical blow. The woman had indeed been preparing to kill herself and as many Americans as possible. His decision had been correct from a tactical standpoint, but that knowledge didn't diminish the emotional weight of what he'd just done. Good shot, kid, Dauber said quietly. You saved lives today. But Kyle didn't feel like a hero. He felt like someone who had just learned that war was far more complicated and morally ambiguous than anything he'd been taught to expect. The woman he'd killed had been a legitimate threat, but she'd also been someone's daughter, probably someone's wife, definitely someone's mother. The child she'd been carrying was now an orphan because of Kyle's decision. That fact would remain true regardless of the tactical necessity of the shot. Kyle understood that this complexity, the simultaneous correctness and tragedy of his actions would define his understanding of combat for the rest of his career. As the Marines secured the area and evacuated the child, Kyle began breaking down his shooting position. The technical aspects of the engagement had been perfect. Accurate range estimation, proper breathing technique, clean trigger squeeze, immediate threat assessment after the shot. But the emotional aftermath was just beginning. How you holding up? Dauber asked as they prepared to relocate to their secondary position. Kyle considered the question carefully. I did what I had to do, but that doesn't mean it feels good. Dauber nodded. That's the right answer, son. The day this feels easy is the day you need to find a different job. Over the following weeks, Kyle learned more about the woman he'd killed. Intelligence reports indicated she'd been coerced by insurgent forces who threatened her remaining family members if she didn't carry out the attack. She'd been given an impossible choice: kill Americans or watch her other children die. The revelation weighed heavily on Kyle. It wasn't just about the shot anymore. It was about the invisible chains of fear and coercion that war wrapped around civilians, forcing them into roles they never would have chosen. He lay awake at night thinking about how many of the enemies he would face were there because they had no other option. Sometimes, in the quiet moments between missions, Kyle caught himself staring at the faces of women and children in the villages below. He no longer saw them as anonymous figures in the crowd. He wondered about their stories, about what they might be forced to do if someone held a gun to their families' heads. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops, Kyle cleaned his rifle with methodical precision. Dauber sat nearby, scribbling notes in a small, worn journal. You keep replaying it, don't you? Dauber asked without looking up. Every day, Kyle admitted. I tell myself it was the right call, but the truth is, I don't know if I'll ever believe that. Dauber closed the journal and studied him. You're not supposed to believe it. You're supposed to live with it. That's the job. We make choices no one else can make, and we carry the weight so others don't have to. Kyle didn't respond, but the words sank deep. When their unit rotated back toward the main base weeks later, Kyle found out the child had survived and been placed in the care of a coalition-run orphanage. Something inside him needed to see for himself. He stood outside the gates one afternoon, dressed in civilian clothes, just another face in the crowd. Beyond the rusted bars, he spotted the boy. The child was playing in the dirt, tracing lines with a stick, his small laughter rising above the din of other children. He seemed oblivious to the war, at least for the moment. Kyle felt his chest tighten. that boy would never know the full story, how close he had come to death, how his mother had been forced into an impossible decision, how a stranger on a rooftop had changed the course of his life forever. Dauber joined him quietly, folding his arms as he watched. "You can't carry all of this, you know," he said. "I already do," Kyle replied. Dauber sighed. "Maybe so, but understand this, that kid is alive because of you. He may never thank you, he may even grow up hating you, but today he's breathing. That's what matters." Kyle kept watching, memorizing every detail of the boy's face that he knew he would carry the image into every mission that followed. To him, the child wasn't just a reminder of what had happened, it was a reminder of why decisions in combat were never black and white. That night, back in the barracks, Kyle lay awake listening to the hum of distant generators. That he understood something he hadn't before. Medals, commendations, praise from commanders, none of it mattered. What mattered were the lives spared and the ghosts carried, and from that day forward, he knew the ghosts would always outnumber the medals. The shot had been perfect, the aftermath would haunt him forever. This information made Kyle's decision both more justified and more tragic. That he'd prevented the deaths of innocent Marines, but he'd also been forced to kill someone who was as much a victim as a perpetrator. The moral complexity of modern warfare had been compressed into a single trigger squeeze. 3 months later, Kyle received a Bronze Star Medal for his actions that day. The citation praised his decisive action under combat conditions that saved the lives of multiple American service members. Kyle accepted the award with appropriate military courtesy, but he never displayed it prominently. Years later, Kyle would accumulate 160 confirmed kills, making him the deadliest sniper in American military history. He would receive Silver Stars, additional Bronze Stars, and recognition as one of the most effective warriors of his generation. But he would always remember his first shot as the moment he learned that being right and feeling good about it were entirely different things. The woman in Nazariah taught Chris Kyle that courage wasn't about feeling fearless, it was about making necessary decisions despite being afraid. That moral clarity, combined with exceptional marksmanship skills, would define his legendary career as a sniper. But it all began with a trembling hand, a difficult decision, and the understanding that some choices change you forever, regardless of whether they're correct. Kyle's first shot established a pattern that would characterize his entire military career. Technical precision applied to morally complex situations where hesitation could cost American lives. He learned to live with the weight of these decisions, but he never learned to carry them easily. The child he'd orphaned that day was eventually reunited with relatives and evacuated from the combat zone. Kyle never learned her name or what happened to her afterward, but he thought about her regularly. She represented the unintended consequences of warfare that even perfect soldiers couldn't eliminate. Sometimes being a warrior meant accepting responsibility for outcomes you couldn't control, while maintaining the focus necessary to protect the people depending on your skills and judgment.
See you in the next videos. Don't forget to like and subscribe.